The once thriving planet of Valdora was now nothing more than a lifeless wasteland. Towers of glass and steel, which had once sparkled in the light of distant suns, lay shattered and burned, their remains scattered across the charred surface. Black clouds of smoke billowed into the sky, casting an eerie shadow over the broken city below. The war had taken everything, every tree, every home, every life. Captain Marcus Vance crouched behind the remains of a destroyed building. His uniform, torn and smeared with dust and blood, clung to his body like a second skin. His team was gone. He had watched them fall, one by one, in a failed mission to retrieve a vital piece of technology from the Kirithi, an alien race that had invaded the planet. Now, Marcus was alone. He stared at the wreckage around him, his heart heavy with grief, but there was no time to mourn. The Kirithi forces were still out there, hunting him, and they would not stop until he was dead. He gripped his weapon tightly, eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. There had been no reinforcements sent to help, no hope for escape. Valdora was a lost cause, and so was the mission. Yet in the midst of all this chaos, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the wind, a faint shimmer in the distance. But then he saw it again, a figure, lying motionless on the ground near the edge of the city ruins. Marcus squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was an alien, but unlike any he had seen before. Her body was sprawled out across the dirt, her limbs twisted in unnatural ways. Blood soaked her armor, staining the sand beneath her. He took a cautious step forward, his instincts warning him to stay alert, but curiosity pulled him closer. As he approached, the alien's features became clearer. She was tall, even taller than him, with skin that shimmered in shades of blue and silver. Her face was angular, sharp, and hauntingly beautiful, though it was marred by the blood and dirt that covered her. Her eyes, which once might have been vibrant, were now closed, and her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. "Is she alive?" Marcus muttered to himself. The Kirithi were merciless creatures, and he knew that if she had been left here, it was because her own people had given up on her. Marcus kneeled beside her, checking her pulse with the tips of his fingers. It was weak, but it was there. She was still alive. A cold gust of wind swept through the broken city, kicking up dust and debris, but Marcus hardly noticed. His mind raced as he considered his options. The Kirithi had left her for dead. She was no longer of any use to them. But was it right to just leave her here? Something about the way she lay there, abandoned and vulnerable, stirred a sense of duty within him. He couldn't leave her. Not like this. "Come on, stay with me," he whispered, more to himself than to her. His eyes scanned the horizon again. The Kirithi could be back at any moment. He didn't have much time. Marcus knew there was a chance that helping her might make things worse. She was an enemy, a member of the race that had devastated this planet. The Kirithi had no compassion for anyone but themselves. They would probably kill him on sight if they saw him helping her. But something in his gut told him that he couldn't leave her to die. Not when she had no one else. He quickly pulled a small medical pack from his belt. It wasn't much, just basic supplies for minor wounds, but he was trained for this kind of situation. Carefully, he applied the necessary treatments to her, trying to stabilize her condition. He had to be quick. If he didn't, she would die, and he'd be stuck in this place alone. As he worked, he couldn't help but wonder who she was. What had brought her to this point? She was clearly no ordinary Kirithi soldier. Her armor, though battered, was intricate, and there was a sense of nobility to her. She wasn't just a random soldier. There was something different about her. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft groan. The alien woman shifted slightly, her eyes fluttering open. At first, they seemed confused, unfocused, and then, slowly, they locked onto Marcus. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said it all. Who was he? Why was he helping her? Marcus leaned back slightly, giving her space but ready to defend himself if necessary. "You're alive," he said, his voice calm but tired. "I saved you." The Kirithi woman blinked, still trying to comprehend the situation. She tried to sit up, but the effort seemed too much, and she collapsed back onto the ground with a groan of pain. "You need to rest," Marcus said gently. "You're not strong enough to move yet." The woman's gaze shifted around, finally landing on the wreckage of the city. Her expression darkened, and Marcus could see the pain in her eyes. She wasn't just injured. She was broken, in every sense of the word. Her people had betrayed her, abandoned her, and now she was left in a world that no longer cared. Marcus felt a strange pang of sympathy. Despite everything, the war, the loss, the destruction, he saw something in her that he couldn't ignore. Perhaps she was not so different from him after all. As he watched her, he made a silent vow. He would not leave her to suffer. He would get her out of here, somehow, even if it cost him his life. The sound of distant explosions echoed across the ruined city, the reminders of a war that had already taken far too many lives. Marcus Vance stood above the woman he had saved, Tessa, trying to stay alert. His heart pounded in his chest, not only from the stress of the situation, but also from the responsibility he now carried. She was an alien, an enemy soldier of the Kirithi, yet Marcus had spared her life. What if she turned on him the moment she regained her strength? What if she had plans to betray him? He couldn't afford to think like that. He'd seen the brutal violence of the Kirithi firsthand, and he knew their cruelty was without measure. But Tessa, she didn't seem like them. There was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't the same as the other Kirithi he'd fought. He had seen the rage in their eyes during battle. But this woman, she was different. She was broken, lost, and it seemed as though she had been abandoned by her own kind. Marcus crouched down beside her again, his mind racing. "You need to get up," he said gently, offering her a hand. Tessa glanced at him, unsure, but slowly she took his hand. Her grip was weak, but it was there. Her eyes fluttered open again, and she looked around, taking in the desolation. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice faint and strained. "You're on Valdora," Marcus said. "My planet. Well, what's left of it? You were left behind, abandoned by your own people." Tessa blinked as the weight of his words began to sink in. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She didn't even know where to begin. She had been one of the highest-ranking soldiers of the Kirithi Empire, trusted to lead forces in many battles. But in the end, she had been betrayed. Her comrades had seen her as weak after she had failed them during a major assault. They had left her behind to die. She had accepted her fate, until Marcus had shown up. Her gaze turned back to him, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. The human soldier was strong, but there was something more in his eyes. He didn't seem afraid of her, even though he should be. He had saved her life when no one else would. "Why? Why did you save me?" Tessa asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly. I'm the enemy." Marcus hesitated for a moment, glancing around at the war-torn landscape. "I don't know. Maybe I saw something in you. I don't just kill because someone is the enemy. You're hurt. You didn't deserve this. No one deserves to be left like that." Tessa looked at him with uncertainty. She was no stranger to violence, to battles fought and lives taken. She had never considered mercy as part of the equation, not until now. But Marcus, he wasn't like the soldiers she had fought alongside. There was a quiet determination in his eyes, a refusal to give in to the cruelty around him. He seemed to care about her, someone who was nothing but an enemy to him. It was confusing, but also humbling. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said softly, though her words didn't hold the anger she might have expected. "But thank you." Marcus gave her a small nod, as though acknowledging her gratitude. "You don't have to trust me right away. But I'm not leaving you here. Not like this." Tessa took a slow breath, trying to gather her strength. She was too weak to move on her own, and the planet's harsh conditions only made things worse. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice still fragile. "We need to move. The Carethi will be looking for us soon, and we don't have much time," Marcus said, standing up and pulling her gently to her feet. "I know a place nearby where we can hide until we figure out what to do." As they began to move, Tessa stumbled a little, but Marcus was there to catch her. The weight of her own body felt unfamiliar, and every step was a struggle. Her wounds throbbed, but the care Marcus had given her earlier seemed to be helping. Slowly, she felt some of her strength returning. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her moving. For the first time since she had been left to die, Tessa began to feel a flicker of hope. She had been abandoned by her own people, yet here was a human who cared enough to save her. Despite the odds stacked against them, despite everything she had been taught to believe about humans, she was beginning to see a different side of the species. Maybe there was more to them than she had thought. The journey to their hiding place wasn't easy. The planet's surface was unstable, and the remnants of the Carethi invasion still lingered. Broken ships, wrecked technology, and scattered debris. The air was thick with dust, and the sky above them was dark and heavy, threatening another storm. But Marcus kept moving, his gaze always scanning the surroundings, making sure they weren't being followed. Tessa struggled to keep up, but Marcus didn't let her fall behind. His pace was steady, purposeful, and she had to admit there was something comforting in his presence. He wasn't just strong, he was determined. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for something more. She didn't know what it was yet, but she could feel it, and she felt it in the way he cared for her. An enemy soldier who had just moments ago been left to die. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the small hideout Marcus had mentioned, a deserted building that had once been part of a small settlement on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it would provide them shelter for the night. Marcus helped Tessa inside, where she collapsed onto a dusty cot. She was exhausted, but she couldn't sleep, not yet. Her mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. The human soldier who had saved her life. Had he changed something in her? She didn't know yet, but one thing was certain. This moment, this unexpected act of kindness, had altered the course of her fate. And she had no idea just how much it would change her future. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a red glow across the sky, as the cold wind picked up once again, sweeping through the cracks in the broken walls of their hiding place. Marcus sat on the floor, his back against the crumbling stone wall, keeping an eye on the entrance. Tessa, still recovering from her injuries, rested on a cot nearby. She had drifted in and out of sleep for hours, but now her breathing had become more even, and the pain from her wounds was finally starting to fade. It had been a long, tense day, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Marcus allowed himself to relax, even if just a little. He hadn't realized how exhausted he was, but now that the immediate danger seemed to have passed, the weight of everything came crashing down on him. His comrades were gone, the mission was a failure, and Valdora was lost. And yet, here he was, taking care of a Carethi soldier, a woman who, until just hours ago, had been his enemy. He glanced over at her. She hadn't said much since they had arrived at the hideout. Her eyes were often distant, lost in thought, and Marcus wasn't sure if it was the trauma of the battle or something deeper. Either way, he couldn't help but wonder what was going on in her mind. What was she thinking? Did she feel any sense of gratitude? Or was she just biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to turn on him? Suddenly, Tessa shifted on the cot, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked several times, her gaze focusing slowly on the dimly lit room. At first, her face was a mask of confusion, her eyes searching the unfamiliar surroundings. She sat up slightly, winced, and then froze when she saw Marcus watching her. Where am I?" she asked in a soft voice, the words coming out weaker than she intended. Marcus stood up immediately, moving toward her in a smooth motion. "You're safe. We're still in the city ruins. It's not much, but it's better than out there." Tessa slowly looked around, taking in the abandoned building's crumbling walls and the empty air. It didn't seem like much, barely a shelter at all. But it was a quiet place where they could rest, even for just a little while. Her gaze drifted to Marcus, still standing a few feet away. She wanted to ask him so many questions about who he was, why he had saved her, and what would happen next, but words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, still unsure of how to process everything. "Are you feeling better?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle. He had seen the way she had struggled to sit up, and he could tell she was still weak. But there was something else in her eyes now. Something different. Tessa paused before answering. I'm not sure," she said quietly. "I've never been this vulnerable before." The words caught Marcus off guard. Vulnerable. He had never thought of her that way. In his mind, she had always been one of the Kirithi soldiers, a fierce, unstoppable force. The idea that she could feel weak or helpless was strange to him. "You're not alone here," he said simply, trying to offer comfort. "I'm not going to leave you." Tessa looked at him, a flicker of something passing across her face. Trust, or maybe suspicion. She wasn't sure yet. The Kirithi had never shown mercy, never shown kindness to anyone, not even to their own. What Marcus had done was something she had never expected from an enemy. "Why?" Tessa asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me? I'm your enemy." Marcus hesitated. The answer wasn't simple, and he wasn't sure if she would understand it. "Because it's the right thing to do. I'm not here to fight some endless war, Tessa. I'm here because I couldn't leave you to die. I saw someone who was hurt, and I helped. That's what humans do." Tessa's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't speak for a moment. She could feel the weight of his words. The idea that a human would act out of something as simple as compassion was hard for her to grasp. The Kirithi had always believed in strength above all else. Mercy, kindness, those were weaknesses. But Marcus was different. He didn't see her as just an enemy. He saw her as someone who was worth saving. For a moment, they simply stared at each other in silence. The air between them felt heavy, charged with an unspoken understanding. Tessa had been trained to see humans as nothing more than obstacles, enemies to be crushed. But now, in the quiet of this ruined city, she was beginning to see them differently. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to see herself differently too. Tessa slowly lay back down on the cot, her head resting on the torn fabric, her thoughts still swirling. She had no idea what would happen next. She wasn't sure where she belonged anymore. The Kirithi had abandoned her, and she couldn't go back to them. She didn't belong with them anymore, not after everything she had been through. But could she really trust Marcus? Could she trust a human, someone she had always considered an enemy? There was so much she didn't know. But for now, she knew one thing. Marcus had given her a second chance. Whether it was out of kindness or just a human instinct to help, she wasn't sure. But she wasn't going to waste it. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus gave her a small nod, though she wasn't sure if he had heard her. But the simple acknowledgement was enough. It was the beginning of something new, something that neither of them could fully understand yet. As the night fell over the ruined city of Valdora, Marcus and Tessa remained in their quiet refuge. Both were uncertain of what the future held, but they shared something now, an unspoken bond forged in the heart of war. A bond that would change them both forever. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the ruined building, casting a faint glow on the broken walls. The city outside remained still, a graveyard of its former self, but within the shelter of the crumbling walls, something else stirred. Tessa woke first. Her head felt heavy, and the pain from her wounds still lingered, but there was a sense of clarity now. The darkness that had clouded her mind since she had been abandoned by her people was slowly lifting. Marcus had saved her, cared for her when no one else would. It was an act of mercy she had never expected from the enemy. She still couldn't quite understand it. Why had he done it? She shifted slightly on the cot, wincing as the movement sent a sharp pang through her side. She hadn't fully recovered yet, but she was getting stronger with each passing hour. The care Marcus had given her was working. Her injuries were no longer life-threatening, but her body was still weak, and her mind was full of questions. Tessa looked across the room, where Marcus was sitting near the door, keeping watch. His back was turned to her, but he was alert, his eyes scanning the ruins outside through a cracked window. He had barely slept. She noticed that his face was tired, but there was something about him, something that made her want to understand him more. Why had he saved her? Was he just doing it out of kindness, or was there something more to it? She didn't know the answer yet, but there was a quiet strength in him that spoke of something deeper than just survival. Marcus turned when he heard the soft rustle of movement from the cot. Tessa was awake. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, his voice low but gentle. "I'm alive," Tessa replied, her voice still hoarse, but she gave him a small, sincere smile. "That's more than I could say yesterday." Marcus nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Good to hear. We're not out of danger yet, but we've got time to figure things out." Tessa sat up carefully, trying to ignore the dull ache in her body. "What happens now?" She glanced toward the door, then back at Marcus. "I don't belong with the Scifi anymore, and I'm not sure I can trust them again. But I also don't know if I can trust you either." Marcus stood up and walked over to her, kneeling down in front of her cot. "I get it. You don't owe me anything. I saved you because I believed it was the right thing to do. That's all. But if you're willing to trust me, we can figure something out. I'm not here to hurt you." Tessa stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception, but there was nothing there. He was genuine. She had seen many faces during her time with the Scifi, faces that had lied, faces that had manipulated. But Marcus was different. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about him that made her want to believe him. "I don't know what to do," Tessa said softly. "I've been trained to fight, to kill. That's all I know. But I can't keep doing it. Not like this." Marcus studied her for a moment before speaking. "It's not easy, I know. War doesn't give us many choices, but there's always a way out. You don't have to keep fighting for them, not if you don't want to." Tessa's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "And what about you? You've been fighting too. Why not keep fighting for your people?" Marcus took a deep breath, as though choosing his words carefully. "Because this war, it's been taking too much, too many lives, too much pain. I'm tired of it. I just want to survive. I just want to help where I can. And if that means helping you, then I'll do it." There was a long silence between them. Tessa's mind raced as she processed his words. He wasn't like the others. The soldiers she had known had always fought for honor, for glory, for the Scifi Empire. They never questioned the war, never questioned the cause. But Marcus was different. He fought for something else. He fought for peace. Tessa felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A hope that maybe there was more to life than war. A hope that maybe she could change, that maybe she could help make a difference. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus smiled at her, his eyes warm. "You don't need to thank me, but you're welcome, all the same." For the first time since she had woken up in this strange place, Tessa felt a sense of calm. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like there might be a way out of the darkness. "We should move soon," Marcus said, standing up and looking out the broken window again. "The Scifi forces are still out there. They'll be searching for us." Tessa nodded. She didn't know where they would go, but she knew she couldn't stay here forever. She wasn't sure what role she would play in all this, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to be alone. Not anymore. Together, they would find a way to survive. The air outside the shelter was thick with dust, and the wind howled through the cracked streets, carrying with it the scent of decay. The ruined city of Valdora was a silent witness to the destruction that had ravaged the planet. Tessa and Marcus stood together, looking out at the barren landscape, knowing that they couldn't stay in the hideout for long. The Scifi forces would be searching for them soon. Marcus had packed what little they had, basic supplies, a few weapons, and whatever rations he could find in the nearby ruins. He wasn't sure how long they would last, but it was enough to keep them moving. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They couldn't wait here and hope the danger would pass. They had to take action. Tessa was still weak, but her strength had returned enough for her to walk without help. Her body ached, but she could manage. As she took her first few steps out into the open, she was struck by how different everything seemed now. The world around her was once full of life, full of purpose, but now it was just a graveyard of what had been. She turned to Marcus, who was already scanning the surroundings, his eyes sharp and focused. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice steady but unsure. Marcus paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied the horizon. "We head west. There's a small resistance group there. They're humans who've been fighting the Scifi occupation. If we can reach them, they might be able to help." Tessa's heart skipped a beat. Resistance. She hadn't heard that word in a long time. The idea that humans had been fighting back against the Scifi occupation gave her a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a chance for a better future after all. But she couldn't forget that Marcus had said they were fighting for survival. "Do you think they'll accept us?" Tessa asked, voicing the doubt that lingered in her mind. I'm not sure they'll trust me. I was a Scifi soldier. I fought against them." Marcus gave her a reassuring glance. "We don't know if they'll accept us, but we have to try. They may not trust you right away, but we'll tell them the truth. You don't belong with the Scifi anymore. You're not their soldier. And we can help them in the fight against the Scifi, if they'll let us." Tessa's heart sank a little at the thought. She wasn't sure if she could convince anyone of her sincerity. She had been a soldier for so long, so focused on the mission and her duty to the Scifi, that she had never stopped to question what she was really fighting for. But now, with Marcus beside her, she was beginning to see things differently. She didn't want to fight for an empire that had abandoned her. She didn't want to fight for a cause that had caused so much destruction. Still, the journey ahead would be difficult. They didn't know how far west they would have to travel or how many dangers they would encounter along the way. But Marcus was determined, and for the first time in a long while, Tessa felt a sense of purpose, too. "We'll make it," Marcus said, as if reading her thoughts. "We just have to keep moving." They began walking, keeping a steady pace. The landscape around them was desolate. Ruins of buildings, broken roads, and the occasional wreckage of Scifi ships that had crashed during the invasion. The world felt like it had ended, but there was a small hope now, a thread that they were both holding onto. As they moved through the ruins, Tessa couldn't help but feel a pang of regret for the people she had once served. The Scifi had promised her honor, power, and glory. They had promised her everything. But they had lied. They had used her, discarded her, and left her to die. She had been nothing more than a tool to them. But Marcus had seen something in her that no one else had. He had seen her as more than just a soldier, more than just an enemy. He had saved her life. He had given her a second chance, and that was more than she had ever expected. After several hours of walking, they stopped to rest in the shade of a ruined building. The sun was beating down, and Tessa's body was still recovering from the injury she had sustained in the battle. She sat down carefully on the ground, trying to ignore the pain in her side. Marcus sat next to her, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, ever watchful. "We need to keep moving soon," he said, though his voice was calm. "The Scifi will have patrols out looking for us. We can't afford to be seen." Tessa nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She didn't know how long they could keep running. She didn't know how long they could keep hiding. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going back to the Scifi. She had no place there anymore. "I don't know if I'll ever be accepted by your people," Tessa said, her voice quiet. I don't know if they'll forgive me for what I've done." Marcus looked at her, his gaze steady and understanding. "You don't have to be forgiven by anyone but yourself. The past is done. What matters is what we do now. We can't change what happened, but we can choose who we are now." Tessa looked down at her hands, the hands that had once held a weapon, the hands that had once fought for a cause she thought was right. Now, they were empty. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. But with Marcus at her side, maybe she could figure it out. "We'll find a way," she said, her voice firm. Marcus smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that the journey they had started together was one that could lead to something better. They didn't know what awaited them, but for the first time in a long while, both of them felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something new. Together, they stood up and continued walking, heading into the unknown. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. The wind howled through the empty streets as Tessa and Marcus trudged forward, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They had been walking for hours, the harsh terrain making every step feel heavier than the last. The city they had once known was long gone, replaced by a desolate landscape of broken buildings and abandoned vehicles. The world had changed, and so had they. Tessa had been a soldier for most of her life, a weapon for the Scifi Empire. But now, with every step she took away from the ruins of Valdora, she felt a little lighter. It wasn't that the memories of her past were gone. They lingered in her mind, like shadows that refused to fade. But she was no longer that person, not entirely. She had a new purpose now. Marcus walked beside her, his pace steady and unhurried. He didn't seem tired, despite the long hours of travel, and his eyes were constantly scanning the area, always alert. Tessa admired his strength and resilience, qualities she had learned to respect over the past few days. He had shown her that there was more to life than war, that there was kindness even in the midst of destruction. They had passed through several small villages along the way, but they hadn't stopped to rest in any of them. The people there had given them cautious glances, but no one had dared to ask questions. The fear of the Scifi was still fresh in the air, and there was no room for strangers. Tessa had learned to keep her head down, to avoid drawing attention. She didn't know if the people here would accept her, and she wasn't ready to face that just yet. After another few hours of walking, Marcus stopped, raising his hand to signal that they needed to rest. Tessa's legs ached from the long journey, and her stomach growled in protest. They had only a small supply of food left, and it wouldn't be enough to get them much further. "We should find shelter for the night," Marcus said, looking around the barren landscape. "We can't keep going like this without more supplies." Tessa nodded, her gaze scanning the horizon. In the distance, she saw the silhouette of a small building, half hidden by the overgrown brush. It didn't look like much, but it was better than nothing. "Over there," she pointed. "It looks like a small cabin. Maybe we can find something useful." Marcus agreed, and they both started toward the cabin, their steps cautious but quick. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the land. The air was cooling, and the wind had died down, making the journey a little easier. When they reached the cabin, Marcus gently pushed the door open, testing it for resistance. It creaked, but it opened without difficulty. Inside, the air was stale and musty, but the space was empty, save for a few old wooden crates and a shelf covered in dust. There was a small fireplace in the corner, and a few abandoned tools scattered across the floor. It wasn't much, but it would do. "We'll rest here for the night," Marcus said, his voice calm. "But we'll need to find food and water tomorrow. This place isn't safe for long." Tessa nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't the safety of a real home, but it was a safe haven for now. She sat down on one of the crates and began to stretch her sore limbs. She could feel the weight of the journey starting to catch up with her, but she pushed it aside. She had to stay strong. For Marcus. For herself. As the evening went on, the silence between them grew more comfortable. Marcus had started a small fire in the fireplace, and the warmth from the flames filled the cabin. Tessa didn't say much, but she watched him carefully as he worked, noticing the way he moved with a quiet confidence. There was something about him, something that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, they could find a way out of this war. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I've been thinking about the resistance group we're headed toward. I'm not sure how they'll react to you. They've been fighting the Scifi for years. They've lost a lot of people. If they see you as a former soldier, they might not trust you at all." Tessa looked up at him, her heart sinking at the thought. "I understand. I'm not asking for their forgiveness. I just want to help. I want to make things right." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "It won't be easy, but you've already taken the first step. You're not with the Scifi anymore. That's all you can do, show them who you are now." Tessa felt a sense of determination building inside her. She didn't know if she could ever erase the mistakes of her past, but she was willing to try. She had a chance now, a chance to fight for something that mattered. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was someone who could make a difference. "We'll get there," Tessa said quietly. "And when we do, I'll prove to them that I'm not their enemy." Marcus smiled, his eyes softening. "I believe you." As the fire crackled in the corner of the cabin, Tessa allowed herself to relax for the first time in days. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she wasn't alone. For the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she had hope. Tomorrow would be a new day, a day for change. And Tessa was ready. The morning light was soft, casting a golden glow over the landscape. Tessa and Marcus had packed up what little they had and were ready to continue their journey. The cabin had offered them shelter, but it was time to move on. The resistance group that Marcus had spoken about was still miles away, and the Scifi forces could be anywhere. There was no time to waste. Tessa stood by the door of the cabin, looking out at the empty road ahead. Her mind was still heavy with doubt, but she knew one thing. She couldn't go back. No matter what awaited them, she couldn't return to the life she had left behind. The Scifi had no place for her anymore. "Ready?" Marcus asked, his voice calm as always. Tessa nodded, her heart racing in her chest. "Let's go." They moved quickly, traveling through the quiet morning, their steps purposeful but cautious. The air was cool, and the sound of distant birdsong was the only thing that broke the silence. The world seemed peaceful in a way that felt almost unreal, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they walked, Tessa found herself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. Just days ago, she had been a soldier, loyal to the Scifi Empire, doing her duty without question. Now, she was walking beside a human, someone who had been her enemy only a few weeks ago. And yet Marcus had been the one to save her life. Marcus had been the one to show her kindness when she had least expected it. "How much farther?" Tessa asked, breaking the silence. "Not far," Marcus replied, glancing over at her. "We should reach the resistance group by late afternoon. But we need to be careful. They won't be easy to convince." Tessa felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. The idea of facing a group of strangers, especially people who had been fighting against the Scifi for so long, was intimidating. What if they saw her as a threat? What if they didn't believe that she was on their side? "I don't know if they'll trust me," Tessa admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus stopped and turned to face her. "They'll see your actions, not your past. You can't change what you've done, but you can show them who you are now. And that's what matters." Tessa met his gaze, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just walking into the unknown. She was walking toward a chance for something better. It was a chance to prove that she could be more than the soldier she had once been. She could be part of something good, something worth fighting for. They continued on their journey, the sun climbing higher in the sky as they moved forward. The road ahead seemed endless, but Tessa's steps grew steadier with each passing hour. She wasn't sure what would happen when they reached the resistance, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep running from her past. She had to face it, no matter how hard it was. By the time they reached the outskirts of the resistance camp, the sun was beginning to set. The camp was small, tucked away behind a thick wall of trees and foliage, hidden from the view of any Scifi patrols. It was a place that felt both safe and dangerous, a place where people had come to fight for their freedom. Marcus led the way through the trees, his movements careful and deliberate. Tessa followed closely behind, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She was about to face the people who had been fighting for the very thing she had lost: freedom. As they neared the camp, Marcus raised his hand, signaling for Tessa to stop. He turned to her, his expression serious. "Stay close to me. They might be hesitant to trust you at first, but we'll do this together." Tessa nodded, swallowing her nerves. "I understand." They approached the camp cautiously, and soon they were greeted by a group of resistance fighters, humans, like Marcus, who had been fighting the Scifi occupation for years. They stood with weapons in hand, their eyes wary as they assessed the newcomers. Marcus stepped forward, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "I'm Marcus. This is Tessa. We're not enemies." The leader of the group, a tall woman with a scar across her cheek, stepped forward. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Tessa. "Tessa, a Scifi soldier." Tessa held her breath, waiting for the judgment to come. But instead, the woman's expression softened slightly. "We've heard rumors," the woman said, "that some of your people have been turning against the Scifi. But we'll need to see if that's true. Actions speak louder than words." Tessa didn't know what to say. She had no excuses, no way to prove herself except for what she was willing to do now. "I'm not who I was," Tessa said quietly, her voice steadied despite the fear in her chest. "I've left that life behind. I want to help." The woman studied her for a long moment before nodding. "We'll see what you're made of then." The resistance members stepped aside, allowing Tessa and Marcus to enter the camp. Tessa's heart was still pounding, but she felt a strange sense of hope stirring within her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance to make a difference. As the camp settled for the night, Tessa and Marcus sat together by the fire. The flames flickered in the dark, casting shadows across their faces. Tessa turned to Marcus, her voice soft. "Thank you for everything." Marcus smiled, his eyes kind. "You're not alone anymore. We'll face this together." And for the first time, Tessa felt like she had truly found a place where she belonged.